The media serving as the public watchdog. Reporters covering the Randy Duke Cunningham bribery scandal win journalism's top prize and take the San Diego Union-Tribune to a new level. Good evening, I'm Rebecca Tolan in for Gloria Penner. We'll talk with the reporters who broke the biggest bribery scandal in congressional history. Also in tonight's show, learn why young people really are different than previous generations. We'll talk about a new book chronicling Generation Me and why youths are more self-absorbed than ever. And later in the show, we'll take you on a ride, a low ride, to learn more about lowrider car culture. But first, there were no leaks from unnamed sources, no insider tips. It was just old-fashioned enterprise by curious reporters. Their work uncovered the most outrageous case of congressional bribery and led to a prison term for a corrupt lawmaker. Last Monday, the Pulitzer Prize Board recognized the San Diego Union-Tribune and Copley News Service for unearthing the corruption of Randy Duke Cunningham. The board singled out reporters Marcus Stern and Jerry Kammer for their notable work. Earlier today, I had the chance to interview the reporters visiting from Washington. Well, welcome to Full Focus. Mark, you're really responsible for breaking the Cunningham story. How did you uncover what became the biggest bribery scandal in congressional history?
Well, I was sitting at my desk trying to learn something about answer a question about Congressman Cunningham that I still don't have an answer to. But after an hour or so of going through public records and chasing down some leads, I decided before I stopped for that session, I would check to see if he'd upgraded his living accommodations. And I saw that he'd purchased a house for $2.55 million a year and a half or 2 years earlier. And I thought, well, that's an awfully expensive house for a guy who came to Congress without a whole lot of money. And so I went to see, how much he sold his house for, because it's quite possible in that roaring market that he may have made enough money from his prior sale to cover the cost of the new house. And so I looked, and it was $1.67 million, and I thought that's a lot of money given what he paid for it, but it's possible. However, I noticed that the person who bought it was an address probably in Washington, 1523 New Hampshire Avenue, Inc. So I had to find out what that was. And in the Secretary of State records in the state of Nevada, it was listed as a company owned by Mitchell Wade. He also had a company registered in Nevada called MZM Inc. So I then Googled MZM Inc. and saw that it was a defense contractor that had been doing very little business until just the last couple of years, and it all of a sudden had gone from nothing basically to being one of the largest defense contractors in the country.
At what point did you realize the magnitude of what you were discovering?
Well, at that point I realized the magnitude of that initial finding. But what I had no idea of until Jerry and others and we all started pulling on the string was to the degree of the corruption. It went well beyond anything I imagined at that moment.
Now, Jerry, in your years as a reporter, you've covered a lot of crime, including the savings and loan scandal with Charles Keating. Nonetheless, how surprised were you as you started making these discoveries and joined in the investigation?
I think we were very surprised at how widely the system of earmarking, of putting projects into appropriations bills, is abused in Congress, especially by members of the Appropriations Committee like Cunningham. And Cunningham really was the most outrageous example of a practice that is all too common in Congress. It is a system that is used by members of Congress basically to ensure their reelection. It does a lot of favors for people at big cost to the taxpayers.
I think a lot of people don't even know what earmarking is. Describe what it is and how you see it working in Washington.
An earmark is a special project that is inserted into an appropriations bill, frequently for millions of dollars and frequently without any sort of congressional oversight. Members of Congress are allowed, as part of their office when they're on appropriations committees. Sometimes we believe Cunningham had $50 million of earmarks that he was allowed to dole out as he saw fit.
That was for just one subcommittee, yeah.
Yeah. The Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. And so this is a process in which defense contractors can find a politically well-connected lobbyist and then use the lobbyist contacts with the Appropriations Committee, Cunningham, Jerry Lewis, the chairman, to get millions of dollars in earmarks at a relatively low cost.
Now, is that where you picked up the thread of the story, that you started looking into the earmarking?
Yes. After Mark and I worked on the sale of Cunningham's boat, and Mark did some great work about the earmarking process, about the favors Cunningham was doing for Mitchell Wade, who bought his house. And we wanted to look at it more systematically, and we could see just how widespread this abuse was, and we were astonished at how blatant the process is and how little accountability there is.
Mark, what kind of initial reactions did you get from Cunningham, from Congress, and anybody else?
Well, the initial conversation I had with former Congressman Cunningham before the story ran was a very relaxed, comfortable one. He clearly felt that this was not a problem area for him, and I really don't think he saw it coming. Mm-hmm. And then after the story ran, the editorial page of the Union Tribune had a very scathing editorial. There was letters to the editors, just a full page of very angry readers, and many of them retired military, incensed over the implications of the first story, and but then there was silence from Cunningham. I mean, he canceled all his public appearances, I think, for about 11 days, and then he finally came out and did make a statement in which he reversed some of the things he said in the initial interview. He acknowledged the very, very close friendship he had with the defense contractor, and he admitted to having used bad judgment, but said that he had done nothing wrong and he would stick it out.
Now, you mentioned that there were some angry Republicans, and the Union Tribune has often traditionally been thought of as a conservative paper. It came out and endorsed Cunningham every time he ran for re-election. Was there any resistance to what you were finding?
Absolutely none.
None.
Yeah, I'm doing.
Well, and that's just as it should be, of course, in a newspaper. A lot of readers don't understand the separation between the editorial page and the news pages of a newspaper. There is a firewall between the two, and there was never any political pressure on us. Mark did his first stories, completely without any suggestion that he not do it, and so it continued throughout the project. And then the editorial page wrote some wonderful editorials critical of Cunningham and critical of the earmarking process. So we certainly felt as if we were seeing this abuse through similar eyes.
I think if you look at the Union Tribune, you'll see other examples of what they call watchdog stories, and I think they're very big on that. And it's very clear that the news pages, and I don't even think the editorial pages, will get in the way of that kind of reporting, or go against it in the case of the editorial pages. I think that they seem to be in sync. They really want to do this kind of work. Yeah. And they're doing a lot of it.
At one point, Full Focus interviewed the federal prosecutors in this case, and they really openly credited your reporting with their investigation and later prosecution. Why do you think it took regional reporters to uncover this?
Well, because I think national reporters, we work out of the Washington bureau, and national reporters cover what I like to call the kabuki and the blather of Washington, which everybody's covering the same story, which tends to be speeches and press conferences or regurgitating conventional wisdom all simultaneously in the same form. And but regional reporters have responsibilities, and they have to cover their local delegation, and they have to cover the economic stake that their communities have in Washington. And I think to the extent that regional reporters do their job well, to the extent that we all field our various positions, it's our best hope really to cover the government, the federal government, well.
Well, speaking of the federal government, are there any signs that this system of congressional earmarking that we've been talking about and lobbying will be reformed as sort of a byproduct of this investigation?
There have been efforts thus far that I would call tentative, and there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of resistance because this is an incumbency protection program. Earmarks are a great way for politicians, incumbent members of Congress, to get themselves a lot of campaign contributions. At the same time, they're doing favors for well-connected and affluent people in their districts who are the beneficiaries of these earmarks. Now, earmarks in themselves there's nothing wrong with them. I mean, there are very good earmarks with a clear public purpose. It's the abuse of the process in which they're done secretly and without any sort of oversight that is or perhaps anti-democratic.
So on that note, I'm wondering where your reporting's going from here, what threads you're following up on, and if we can still expect to see some discoveries from you two and the other team of reporters that worked on
Well,
this.
there's still a lot that has not been resolved in this situation. We have some unindicted co-conspirators out there, defense contractor Brent Wilkes, and we're still waiting to find out what happens with Mitchell Wade, and ultimately, although he has pled guilty. And we have some other folks that the U.S. Attorney's Office is dealing with, and more than just the San Diego U.S. Attorney's Office. And I guess it would be only fair that that I return the U.S. Attorney's Office. You said you had them on. I think it was Phil Halpern. He said something very nice about us, and they did they just went from 0 to 60, and they delivered a stunning. What would have been a stunning indictment, except that it became a stunning plea agreement.
Yeah.
And that was that was because of the case they must have put together.
And on the news side, Dean Calbreth and the other reporters of the UT are doing a wonderful job following on the threads. We're all waiting, of course, to see what happens with Brent Wilkes, unindicted co-conspirator #1, and Dean has done a marvelous job with that.
Well, congratulations to both of you, Mark Stern and Jerry Kammer. Thanks a lot for stopping by.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Coming up next, the personality traits of Generation Me. They've been called the entitlement generation and Generation X. These independent, self-absorbed, and ambitious people are storming into schools and businesses all over the country. Psychologist Jean Twenge calls the group of people born in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s Generation Me. Her research shows they are vastly different from previous generations. She says a strong emphasis on self has real consequences for young people and society. Jean Twenge is also an associate professor at San Diego State University. She joins us to talk about her book, Generation Me, Why Today's Young Americans Are More Confident, Assertive, Entitled, and More Miserable Than Ever Before. Also with us is David Peters, a licensed family therapist in private practice. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Jean, we are talking about a pretty big range here. People in their teens, 20s, and 30s. Why did you decide to lump so many different generations together?
Well, it's a little longer than the average span of a generation, which is usually more like 20 years. But school programs, parents, the media all started to emphasize self-esteem and focusing on the self really beginning in the early 80s. So if you were born 1970 and afterward, you've really been exposed to all of those ideas, and it's continued since the early 80s, and it really hasn't stopped.
Okay. I know you did a lot of research for this. You analyzed surveys from 1.3 million people spanning 6 decades.
Yeah.
Tell me how you reached your conclusions with that data.
Sure. So there's a lot of psychological questionnaires that have been used for over these decades. So things like that measure self-esteem or measure anxiety. So I would find the research reports of dissertations, journal articles from these other researchers, and find that they reported the average score for their sample on these scales, and then I could graph those over time and see how they've actually changed. So it was so nice to have data on real individuals and how those individual personality traits and attitudes have actually changed over time.
Okay, so what did you find? How would you characterize Generation Me?
Well, the thing that really underlies all of the changes is the rise of individualism. So there's higher self-esteem, possibly more narcissism. There's a rise in individualistic traits like assertiveness and leadership and having a strong personality. And then also, on the bad side, there's a rise in anxiety and depression.
Okay. I'm wondering, David, what your impressions of the book were, and if you sort of see the same thing in your private practice as some of the characterizations that she found in her book.
Yes, I do find a lot of similarity in the younger clients that I treat. And the impression didn't make me feel comfortable at all. It seemed a generation more narcissistic, materialistic, naively entitled, and less able to perform in a tough world because they had such high expectations of how easy things would be. So it didn't give me a confidence in the future, although maybe give me a confidence in my work in having to help them cope with the near future.
Good job security for
Yes.
you. I'm wondering, though, do you think that this is a healthy sense of self-esteem, or is it something else parading as that?
Well, I think it's important to be cautious with paper and pencil measures of personality traits, especially those that are self-report. What people say about themselves and what is actually going on inside them often differ, and we know that from a lot of sociological research. I mean, how many people admit to being racist compared to how many might act racist? And the area of self-esteem, as Jean points out in the book, is that this is a generation raised in the language of self-esteem, with the self-esteem curriculum in the schools. So they know the language very, very well. But she also points out that this is a generation who, in the workplace, need far more support, far more encouragement in order to keep them on the job. And so, to me, there might be a different trend happening. I think someone with high self-esteem doesn't need so much encouragement as someone who has really got low self-esteem and knows the language.
Now, Jean, this book argues that this particular group of young people heard a lot of things growing up, like believe in yourself.
That's right.
And I remember growing up with the popular film Free to Be You and Me,
exactly,
which had a lot of those messages. What did you find were the influences that shaped this generation?
So those media influences were really big. If you watch shows like Dawson's Creek or The OC, or just read People magazine, or even the show Seventh Heaven, which is otherwise very conservative, it has this message in there. You have to love yourself before you can love someone else. You have to believe in yourself. All these messages are just really, really pervasive. And so you get, I mean, we can debate, true self-esteem and what that really means, but there is this entitlement and there is that self-focus, that there does seem to be a true belief in this generation that you want to put yourself first. And that's a message that's really been emphasized by a lot of media sources for many different reasons.
So I'm curious then, if there's this belief in the self, why did you also find that there's a higher anxiety rate and depression rate?
Right, that's a good question. Well, I think there's a couple things behind it. The first is, if you're really focusing on yourself and you're not putting as much time as you should into relationships, and maybe you're very independent, then you end up living alone by yourself. You put yourself first, and then you don't have anybody to talk to. You may not have friends. You may not have a romantic relationship. And that's the bedrock of mental health, is those things. I mean, when you don't have those things, then you get a lot of anxiety and depression. Then there's the high expectations, like he was mentioning. I found a lot of evidence for that, too. So they expect too much, and then when they don't get it, they're disappointed. And that can lead to anxiety and depression as well.
So, when you talk about expectations, it's harder to get into college these days. Families need dual income. It's generally more competitive. How do you find then that young people are coping with what they believe to be true and then reality when they get out into the real world? And you probably see some of this in your practice.
Well, I see among the very young who have not gotten into the job market yet very naive expectations of the future. I've spent time talking to a young person into trying to see that, no, you were probably not going to make it as a professional skateboardist. One or two people make it professionally, but that doesn't mean you. And the young people really have a notion that their turn on television is going to come, and they're practicing with the MySpace website, how often they can flash themselves on the screen one way or another. But once they really begin to have to work in the workplace when they're in their 20s, many of them are very angry and bitter about what they really have to do, what they have to accomplish, and how they have to compromise.
So did you look at some of those people in your book in their 20s and 30s to see how they are integrating in the workplace and in society at large?
Yeah, so I got some stories from a bunch of sources on that. And yeah, I couldn't believe some of the stories that I saw. People who thought they were going to be vice president of the company within 3 years, or said, well, this job isn't fulfilling. And this expectation that every job is going to be fulfilling, not really very realistic. And then there's this phrase, never give up on your dreams. Well, most people don't dream about being an accountant or a social worker or a trash collector, but those are three things we really, really need in society, and they can be fulfilling in their own way, but they're not the actors and the skateboarders and so on that kids are dreaming about becoming.
The fame and the fortune and the glamorous kind of roles. So what kind of advice then would you have to young people who grew up with this kind of mentality?
Well, I find a delicate way to let them know it's time to grow up. I don't use that word until they really get to know me and like me. But I will say, you're challenged to do some growth here that you didn't expect. Life's not going to change for you. You're going to have to change for life, or you're going to continue to be miserable. And often I say, you could be in the exact same situation but live in Bangladesh. How bad do you really have it? You know, your mother bought you a car. You know, many people in the world don't. And I have to ride with them with the shock value for a while. But once they sense that I can help them build their sense of courage and a sense of toughness about them, they see the advantage of moving forward.
In the last 30 seconds we have, Jean, I wonder what your hopes are for this book. What message you really hope will get across?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'll say two things. First, that I hope that people really see the real differences between generations, because a lot of other books have kind of guessed at what the differences might be. So I hope they'll read it for that, to understand their kids and understand themselves if they're in this generation. And then also that we really rethink self-esteem programs in schools. They don't seem to be doing any good, and they seem to be actually having a bad effect on children.
All right. Well, Jean Schwange, David Peters, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up next, the culture of riding low. You've probably seen them while driving around town, cars that are tricked out, souped up, and riding low to the ground. Lowrider culture is an urban expression born right here in Southern California. The popularity of what began in the barrio is spreading across the nation and even to countries like Japan. KPBS photojournalist Justin Renaud visited some lowriders at a recent car exhibit at the San Diego Automotive Museum.
The history of lowriding goes back in the 40s. That's when it all began. That's when the Pachucos and Zoot Suiters, probably mostly after World War II, getting out of the service, had a little bit of money, started buying the old Chevrolets, dropping them down, putting blocks or whatever it took in the back of them to set them down.
Lowrider, drives a little slower. Lowrider.
Dressing them up with fender skirts, spotlights, bumper guards, all the accessories, all the chrome accessories.
Everybody knows me as Conejo Rabbit, so I just call it Mr. Rabbit 62. This is a 1962 Chevrolet convertible Impala. A lot of work and a lot of fun, though. You know, especially here in Southern California. You know, when the sun comes out and it's a Saturday morning or Sunday morning, you want to go out and cruise, take it to Tecate, Ensenada, Rosarito, or just cruise around here in downtown San Diego. Modify-wise, first thing we've done, of course, we changed the tires. You know, from the original, some of them have 15, some of them have 14, but we dropped them down to a 13 by 7 tire. We go with the smaller tire to give it that lower look or the lowrider look. We've changed the whole suspension on it. We put hydraulics. I got 2 pumps, one to the front, one to the back. Hit the switches. That thing have a 3-wheel motion. Huh? All the weight to the back, and it'll lift either tire up off the ground completely, so you're only on 3 wheels. Right now I'm just playing with the front switch, making the car go up and down. I got 4 switches here. I got a front, side to side, and I got the back 3-wheel motion. And I got another little special switch here that I attracted a lot of attention when I hit this one, you know, which is, you know, that's when I tell people I'm on their side. So.
This one is called Chase of the 50s. This is a 1950 Chevy Fleetline. Basically GM, all the body stock from the factory except for a few trim that we remove, but other than that, it's a stock factory car. I bought it in '73, and it was just family transportation. And then it was stolen twice in 1 week. And that's when we decided to park it and do a lot of work to it. So many people couldn't afford the hydraulics when they were coming up. This is basically the way it was done. What I really like, these hubcaps, I think I only seen one other pair from all the shows that I've ever been to.
Car fads have come and gone, although lowriding came in the 40s, and it's been around since the 40s. true lowriders are lowriding domestic cars with a focus on General Motors vehicles. And lowriding isn't just something that young kids do and it's a fad they go through. It's something that people have in their heart.
If you'd like to see some Lowrider cars for yourself, visit the Lowrider Tour on June 25th at Qualcomm Stadium. There's more about that event and the stories we talked about on our website at kpbs.org. And if you have a comment about the show, please send it to the address on your screen. Also, join us tomorrow night for a look at the race for mayor of Chula Vista and the issue of eminent domain. For KPBS, I'm Rebecca Tolan. Good night.
On KPBS Tonight, join us at 8 as top waltz and tango artists compete in the International Dance Sport World Championships. Then at 9, Secrets of the Sexes looks for the key predictors of sexual chemistry. Also at 10, American Masters celebrates the music and civil rights contributions of Nat King Cole. KPBS presents new ideas in food, design, style, and life with KPBS Celebrates, a series of special events designed to enhance your entertaining lifestyle. KPBS celebrates the food and wine of Baja at La Costa Resort and Spa on June 4th. To purchase tickets, go to kpbs.org.
California Center for the Arts features museum exhibits, Judith Hersko, Shifting Baseline,